So, Dr. Yipeng, I mean, we know that increasingly it's clear that free speech doesn't extend to people saying free Palestine, right? There's a price to pay. There are consequences for listening to, say, the voice of your conscience, for condemning Israel's actions and Israel's ongoing genocide. And I'd like to just start with asking you what kind of consequences you've had to face and what kind of consequences you've seen others, peers, allies, other activists face once they started speaking up for Palestine.
Yeah, thanks for having me and thank you for the question. I think it's important to ground the most egregious form of repression and suppression of speech being that of the murder of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Palestine, because this is the most egregious form of repression and suppression by Israel and what we understand to be a settler colonial state, but that of one of Zionist ideology, a colonial racist ideology to displace, ethnically cleanse, and colonize Palestine. And the ways in which Zionism can infiltrate and suppress and repress speech in Palestine and around the world, I think then you have more varied kinds of impacts on uh, the individual kind of person and body, and and the same things that we're seeing in Palestine, where people get uh, wrongly detained and jailed and essentially abducted and held without justification by Israel for basically sometimes sharing something on social media. We know of so many student activists what has happened in the West Bank. These things are happening all around the world as well, primarily in so-called Western democratic countries that are settler colonial in their own nature, because their interests are capitalist, colonial, and imperial in nature. Their interests and values align with Israel. And so that's why we're seeing those same kinds of consequences, in my opinion. And so we're seeing that in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, where I'm based, acknowledging that I'm calling in from unceded, unsurrendered, traditional Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory, which is unceded, meaning it is occupied by the settler colonial state of Canada. And things that I've experienced over the past year and a half really pale in comparison to what Palestinians continue to experience on their occupied territories. But what I have experienced is a symptom of the impacts of Zionism in the West, which is being suspended from my residency training program, later being reinstated without any apology, without any acknowledgement of harm, having endured bullying and harassment, intimidation within the Canadian Medical Association as well, for which I was a board member of, enduring many more targeted doxing campaigns by the Zionist lobby, by bad faith reporting and actors who have Israel and Zionist interests at the forefront, and use these doxing campaigns to smear people, to attack one's character, and attack one's personhood and livelihood, which we've seen in so many instances of, doctors, resident doctors. I was a resident doctor at the time when I was suspended. They're going after people's livelihoods and to sow a deep fear of speaking up, which is the bare minimum to do when you're bearing witness to genocide. It's actually not enough to speak up. It's much more important to do something about it, to be in solidarity with Palestinians as they're experiencing the unimaginable, so that we actually put pressure on these systems of power, these systems of oppression, that of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, so that we're actually breaking these ties in which these Western settler colonial states are wholly complicit in Israel's slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza in the West Bank.
Now, you're one of the people who have actually done something about it, whatever was in your capacity. I mean, you went to Gaza, you've been raising your voice, and we're talking about actions here. So going to Gaza, treating people there, that's an action. I want to come to that. But first, I just want to like expand on something you just said, right? It's basically, I mean, these doxing campaigns, right? The harassment, the threats, very real threats of losing one's livelihood, right? I mean, they're there to create a chilling effect. They're there so that, no one. So you make a couple of horrible examples of people and you figure that, okay, now everyone's just going to shut up. Has that happened? I mean, how chilling is the chilling effect?
I think, unfortunately, I think the impacts of this chilling effect are still quite pervasive and effective. Um, I think it would be disingenuous of myself to say that they're not effective, because the ways in which the ongoing Nakba has, continued for generations and decades, right, coming up on 77 years, um, is actually a testament to the strength of this kind of fear that Zionism has such a fierce grip on in the West, because we understand how the suppression and repression and fear of that in the West is deeply connected to why Canada, for example, where I'm based, is still complicit, so strongly complicit in its ties to Israel. And a really easy example for me to think back on is when I was suspended from my training back in November of 2023. I learned a few months later that a plastic surgeon, a mid-career plastic surgeon who went with MSF to Médecins Sans Frontières to like volunteer in Gaza as a plastic surgeon, as a trauma surgeon, in December, and had come back only a month after my suspension, um, had the fear of even speaking about, the cases that she had seen in Gaza as a plastic surgeon, a mid-career plastic surgeon, right? Someone who has authority, who has power and privilege within the institution, who's based, in the city that I work in, and was fearful about even, organizing a grand rounds because of what had happened to me. A month before she went to Gaza. So like the fear of speaking up in the West is more than going to Gaza, like under the bombardment that Israel's campaign had on Gaza at the time, in late 2023. It's just bewildering to me that like this kind of fear is so instilled on people in the West. Um, and it's not by accident, right? Like the
By design.
generations of Zionist propaganda, but also I think, really real fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic or being an anti-Semite. There's also a degree of internalized, anti-Semitism of like, do we actually know what anti-Semitism is now when Zionists continue to conflate, Judaism with Zionism, conflate, anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And so to be able to separate these things out takes time, takes nuance, takes the ability to have that political education and awareness to be able to know and stand firmly with what you know and to speak it like with all of your chest that you stand against injustice in all of its forms, including anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism has been so co-opted and weaponized, and many people actually do not know what the definition of it is. And it's just a very actually simple and straightforward thing when you think about it. Discrimination based off of, ethnic, racial background, being a Jew. And these are things that I also learned when I spent time in Poland, learning about the Holocaust and So when you know things for what they are, and you know history and you study it, and you go back to the history books, you also understand Palestine for what it is as a settler colonial project, as a state of current occupation and apartheid. And this is a long-winded answer of saying I think more and more people are at this point learning about these things, and they're getting better equipped with the political language and analysis to be able to articulate what they're seeing on their phones or on their screens as it relates to Palestine. And they're better able to actually articulate it in the context of Canada as well, I think, as understanding it as occupied territories and how, as immigrants or as settlers, how do we benefit from this system of colonization in the West? And how are we complicit and how are we also responsible for undoing those harms and finding a path forward in dismantling these forms of oppression?
You've
Uh,
been an activist for many, many years, right? You've been speaking up for indigenous persons, people and communities, marginalized communities in Canada. I mean, you mentioned, being on the unceded land of various Indian tribes, Native American tribes. Where did your relationship with Palestine start?
um, it's because of my identity of like when I think about like the ways in which I was like brought into like the work of understanding like systems of oppression. Um, I think it's important to ground myself in like, I was born in China, I was briefly raised in Japan, and I came to Canada when I was 4 years old. Because my parents, wanted me and my younger brother to kind of have like a more opportunities, that kind of thing. And I got Canadian citizenship when I was in grade 5 because my parents passed a citizenship test. And then, over the years growing up, and I didn't really understand what it meant to be Canadian. And when I spent time during my undergraduate studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, which is very close to Six Nations of the Grand River, which is also very close to where I grew up, only about an hour away, the largest First Nations reservation um, in Canada, and knowing about how they're still struggling for clean drinking water from the tap, and they're suing the federal government for their complicity and complacency in not moving forward with clean water on their own lands. Um, and so understanding the history of like genocide of indigenous peoples on this land was a responsibility for me as someone who holds Canadian citizenship, and what is that, and grappling with that identity. So that's how I ended up spending a lot of time thinking about colonialism as a structural determinant of health. And it's because of that understanding I stumbled upon Palestine. I think Palestine was always something that has been in a lot of these shared activist circles of organizing against structural oppression. I think I was hesitant to organize a lot around Palestine because I felt like my duty and obligation was I'm here on occupied Turtle Island. What is my responsibility to, you know, support and be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, Métis on this land? That shared movements for struggle that grow transnationally is deeply important because of how the settler colonial state Canada, for example, is so complicit in Israel's work of settler colonialism. And so because of that study of settler colonialism as a structural determinant of health, I studied Palestine for that exact same kind of framework and lens. And so I learned from Palestinian scholars in that space and also non-Palestinian scholars in that space, and had the privilege of visiting um, uh, occupied West Bank, Jerusalem, 48, historic Palestine, in March of 2023. And this was after, a lot of conversations with a close Palestinian friend, because it weighs heavily on me that I had the privilege of visiting Palestine multiple times as a non-Palestinian when my own Palestinian friends and colleagues have not had their right to return. They have been born in exile as refugees and have not been permitted to return to their own traditional homelands. I think bearing witness of how do you be in true and meaningful solidarity with um, Palestinians in their struggle for liberation. And yeah, and I think the preparation for my initial trip to Palestine was also an academic one. I was I wrote a graduate paper on the impacts of health and healthcare under Israeli occupation and apartheid, and learning about the permitting system of how just to leave Gaza to receive healthcare in any other part of Palestine, Israel controls those ways in which patients can leave for medical treatment for things like, treatable cancers that Gaza at the time did not have the means to provide specialized, cancer treatments or chemotherapy, and they would deny and delay the permits given to patients and sometimes to also their parents and guardians, meaning that they would be unable to travel if they were a child, unable to kind of maneuver those logistics. And so those kinds of structural impacts had devastating effects on people's ability to access healthcare and ultimately has killed patients through preventable, treatable cancers. And so it's
I mean,
been learning about that.
institutionalized cruelty on an unbelievable level, right? I mean, every single aspect of it. And this, Dr. Yipeng, is something that, I mean, I don't want to say shocking, but it is some kind of bewildering that when you come to the medical professions, coming back to the medical profession as a whole, the medical boards, the medical community, doctors' associations, or whatever the equivalent of that is in Canada, right? I mean, it's supposed to start with first do no harm, but for almost 2 years now, we have seen the worst kind of harm done to the Palestinian people. And what I found repulsive, frankly speaking, is so many members of the medical community um, out and out, blatantly on social media, on various fora, supporting genocide. And I'm not just talking about Israel. I mean, talking about Israel, there were those 100 doctors who wrote a letter to the authorities saying, hey, bomb more hospitals. They're filled with Hamas. There are reports from Sderot Yemen, various other prison camps of forced amputations. And I mean, that's really like the surgeon's equivalent of a sniper shooting someone in the knee and crippling them, right? When you have conversations with these people, I mean, give me a sense of how that goes. Can there even be a conversation? Because these are professionals who one hopes and assumes, are there. I mean, the whole job is to take care of humanity, right? And here they're seeing the worst atrocities in living memory, at least in our memory, unfold, and they're like, hey, that's good. I want to see more of those. Where does that come from?
I will answer your question, but I think it's important to actually take a step back and unpack that, medicine, like Western biomedicine, like Western medicine as an institution, is not, you know, like this neutral and like this beautiful, caring thing that cares about humanity and like only does no harm. I think this is like a very beautiful way to think about what medicine is and a very, optimistic way, but is unfortunately not grounded in reality.
Right.
As someone who, entered medicine and public health for that matter, understanding the complexities, but also the contradictions of this profession, I think it's important to start off by saying, like, Western biomedicine as an institution, physicians, doctors as an institution in the West has done horrible, horrible things to Black and Indigenous peoples, like on this land. Justified things like slavery, eugenics, has experimented on First Nations Indigenous children in residential schools through nutritional experiments to see what happens to the starving, child's body when limit their food and water intake. And this was done by physicians. here, and also forced sterilizations of Black and Indigenous women all across Turtle Island. So when we know that like this is what medicine and doctors has done to um, people who are like oppressed, people who are colonized, they are subjected to this kind of um, violence through medicine that is supposed to be this like rosy, do no harm, we care for humanity. I think it's important that we know that history, we learn more about it to be able to understand why these doctors, have these, uh, Zionist ideologies that are white supremacist, fascist, racist, um, why they also do the things that they do now, whether it be in Israel, in occupied Palestine, by justifying, the bombing of hospitals in Gaza by collectively, putting together letters, or participating in like the organ removal of Palestinians from Gaza, um, and returning um, their bodies without organs, or participating in and actually allowing for the torture of Palestinian detainees who've been abducted, taken into Israeli torture camps, to be able to practice medicine under those circumstances and allow for, the amputations from the the restraints put on the arms, or the hands, the wrists, the legs, the ankles, to participate and to kind of allow for the torture to continue in that way. It's important to know that that kind of ideology that allows for those practices, those actions to actually take place within medicine, it's actually always been this way. It's always been this way in the sense that medicine as an institution in the West um, has been co-opted by also capitalism, but primarily through patriarchy and white supremacy to be able to enact and allow for this institution to behave in this manner. So it's actually, for me, I think, taking a step back also, like it's not unsurprising that the Canadian Medical Association behaved in the way that it did.
I mean, it's by no means unique. It's like a continuation of past practices, right? I mean,
Mhm.
like they say, right? Context is king. So yeah, so there's a very, very dark context and history to all of this. I mean, hey, I mean, the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, right? Those come to mind. I mean, so many others. Now coming back to, you went to occupied Palestine or historic Palestine in March 2023, and this was many months, before the October 7th attacks and before the genocide began in earnest. But then you went back to Gaza with a team of your doctors. What did you see there, and what did how did that affect you? Because everything I can see, and every other doctor that I've spoken to or listened to who's come back has come back changed irreversibly. Was it like that for you?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think um, there are ways in which like you are changed by like bearing witness to the worst of what like humanity can take place in front of our eyes, what is allowed to happen, and what like humans can do to other humans, right? Like what like Israel is doing to Palestinians is just horrendous, and to bear witness to genocide is an absolutely like I think it's um hard to also talk about, because like it's not the experience of actually being subjected to genocidal violence and living under occupation, like what a privilege it is to kind of reflect on experience, having had the opportunity to visit voluntarily and then also to exit
Yeah.
and to leave. Um, but the things that in advance of going, I was talking with other doctors about like how to prepare, like what to read up on, and there was just no way to prepare. They told me you just have to go and see it for yourself on the ground. And I was there February, of last year, and this was a few months into the increased genocidal violence that uh, Israel had put on the Gaza Strip, knowing that they had previously endured so many like assaults, like and an over 17-year siege on their land borders and water border for that matter. The primary care clinics that I worked at in central Rafah did not have like basic medicines like antibiotics. We brought a supply of antibiotics and started prescribing them. Um, but the majority of patients that I saw, primarily children, what they needed was clean water, nutritious food, decent shelter, and these were things that were being systematically withheld or systematically being destroyed um, in Gaza. And, uh, I think a lot about a lot of the patients that I saw, and I wonder if they're still alive, because some of the patients that I saw at the time, they were so severely malnourished and dehydrated, some of whom were not walking anymore. I think I've said this so many times now, so I sound like a broken record, but I remember seeing patients that, should have been walking by their developmental milestones, like 12 months, 13 months, 14 months of age, and they were not walking because of severe malnutrition and dehydration. And there's something called rickets disease that we don't really learn about in medical school because it rarely happens. It's severe vitamin D deficiency leading to abnormal bone growth. And we were seeing like multiple cases of suspected rickets disease in the course of a morning in a clinic. We saw children, once again, as old as 10, 9, 10 years old, who were previously walking and now no longer walking because of severe malnutrition, dehydration. And I saw this child that had neurological signs of decline. I could wrap my entire index finger and thumb around their upper arm and lower leg. The World Health Organization told us to screen for malnutrition by using a measuring tape to measure the upper arm circumference to wrap it around the upper arm of a child. But I didn't need this tape. We didn't have this tape, even at the clinic, to know that this child was severely malnourished. And speaking to the local Palestinian doctor, what this child needed was monitoring in likely a pediatric intensive care unit to allow them to be refed, because it's actually quite dangerous to just refeed with normal food. You could do some damage to the organs if you're not careful with how you refeed any person, let alone a child. But he said there's no such service, there's no such hospital that could do this. And so all we could offer this child was IV fluid, which only introduces another source of possible infection, irritates the child, and also is really distressing for the parent to kind of witness like this is all we can do for their kid. I remember leaving Gaza, and there was like a few days or two a week. And then we heard the official numbers and reports that there were patients dying in the north from malnutrition. And those kinds of like numbers and statistics that get reported, I think it's really important to highlight that they are just merely the tip of the iceberg, because the estimation of like patient deaths is like so grossly like inaccurate, because it's like
Yeah.
valued, like it's like you have to like actually die in front of a patient, in front of a doctor or a nurse in a functioning clinic or hospital to be counted as a death, to be attributed to something like dying from severe malnutrition. Reflecting on that experience in the that 1 week that I had left and had heard that report, I was surprised that those numbers actually didn't come sooner, because I felt like there were there were patients that had already died in this way, and they were not being reported and counted, because you actually have to come to the clinic. Like there are some Palestinian doctors who are doing this work of going to patients in the displaced tents, but this is also something that was not permitted for international doctors, because somehow our lives are worth more than local Palestinian doctors, and we were, not permitted to leave the hospital or clinic grounds. And it's just like I remember even then, they were saying like in the north, people were using, animal feed to,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, I think talking a lot about the piece around like starvation and lack of access to nutritious food and clean water and medicines, because this is what I was seeing mostly in the primary care clinics. But this is only one actually tiny facet of the genocide, right? Like
Mhm.
was the ongoing bombing and decimation of like hospitals entering and initially we were supposed to work at Al Nasser Hospital. We didn't because it was surrounded by tanks. And during our time in central Rafah, working at those primary care clinics, I would go to some of the WHO coordinating meetings in the morning, and they would tell us, and we would get updates about how multiple, convoys to kind of go and assess the situation at Al Nasser Hospital were being denied, like United Nations convoys, just to kind of assess. Or they were trying to send, I think, someone to help assist with stopping the plumbing system because there was sewage flowing into the emergency department. You can imagine how, like, in a hospital, you're supposed to have sterile and clean working environments. Anyways, the sewage was spilling into the emergency department because of attacks by, Israeli fire. They were being denied just to kind of assess that situation, even. And later, while we were still in central Rafah, like the Al Nasser medical complex was invaded by the Israeli forces. Healthcare workers were detained, some of them killed. And later we have found mass graves around Al Nasser Hospital, um, including patients, including healthcare workers. And this has not only happened to Al Nasser Hospital, it's happened in many other hospitals. And um, so I think like understanding how genocide has unfolded in all these different ways. And I'll also just say, like, we had the privilege of visiting the European Gaza Hospital in Eastern Khan Yunis as well, to deliver supplies that we had brought in. And I remember visiting the intensive care unit at European Gaza Hospital, and there were multiple pediatric patients that had gunshot uh, injuries, wounds to the head and chest. And um, other doctors have testified and shared this information as well. Um, and this kind of like policy and practice, sustained policy and practice by Israel to target children, Palestinian children, um, kill shots. You don't, why are you shooting children in the head, in the chest, to kill them? And so we saw these things. Um, and of course it changes you, I think, because it really makes you like worry about a full descent into um, inhumanity by bearing witness to this kind of violence. I do want to also say that the contrast to this is also really significant. Like I was welcomed by Palestinian healthcare workers with so much care and kindness and dignity. Um, it was actually healing to be with Palestinian healthcare workers despite like all the circumstances that they were enduring and going through, having lost family members, having lost close ones, and still like doing the work of going to the hospitals and clinics and providing healthcare. It was yeah, really, really inspiring to spend time and space with them. And it was really emotional for me because like despite everything that they've been through and still go through, they have such care and kindness in receiving people like myself. Like the first thing that I remember that happened when we arrived at the hospital and was put in a room so that we could rest after making that long journey through you know, the Sinai, through Egypt, through the Rafah border, was being put in this room so that they put like water and hot food in front of us. And I remember thinking like there's such little food and water to go around, um, that they were still offering it to us. And in fact, it happened a few times where actually the only hot meals that I ate while I was in Gaza in Rafah was with um, the like healthcare workers, local healthcare workers that we were with, because we meant to be entirely self-sustainable in bringing in the food, water, that would last us. But the kindness, you know, and the dignity and the graciousness of the, you know, Palestinian people that received us is just uh, something truly unique, something that I don't think I've really felt before in this kind of like um, degree, or to this kind of like also contrast in knowing like what they're going through, and knowing uh, you know, what society can truly look like when we share, when we
Mm.
care about one another. Um, and I don't even see that in some of the spaces I find myself in on this other side of the
Yeah.
planet. So there's so much that Palestinians, the people of Gaza, are teaching me, us, the world. They're teaching life. They're teaching what it means to like have dignity and practice care and justice in the face of their colonial genocidal erasure. And there's something really beautiful in that. And I think I remember kind of describing a situation, you know, an interaction that I had, and I said it's like, and it was to a Palestinian friend, and I was saying it's like sad and or but beautiful, sad and beautiful. And he just, you know, had a very quick response to me. He's like, "That's Palestine for you." And it's really brought home, you know, for me, like how how we can hold these tensions and complexities, and what we can learn from this situation. But I don't think I say this all, and I think it's really important to say, you know, like let's not like put the Palestinians, the people or the specific people in Gaza, you know, let's not put them on a pedestal, not
Yeah.
over glorify them, because this does not do any good for their liberation. They are human, just like you and I, but the ways in which they teach the world how to resist and persist and and exist in all of their ways, um, despite this genocidal colonial violence that is so overt and now is continuing in many different ways. Um, like that is a gift to the world to kind of teach us like what a society, what a world without capitalism, without colonialism, without imperial expansion, what a world that could look like in the ways we treat each other. Like it all starts with how we treat each other. And I think it's also a lesson for like building intersectional movements for social, political change all around the world. And in these movements, how we treat each other as human beings with kindness and dignity and respect is so deeply important. And to also be able to agree to disagree in um, a movement for collective liberation, this is super important as well. And knowing that we're all moving towards that common horizon of collective liberation for all peoples, including and especially for Palestinians, because the example of settler colonialism in Palestine is such an overt one that we can all draw lessons from in terms of how those tactics and tools of settler colonialism are so um, egregious and an assault on our collective humanity, because what is happening in Palestine gets imported, exported to all around the world. And that is, I think, a testament to your first question about, the fear or the things that are happening to people around the world who just simply want to speak about what is happening in Palestine, let alone, action or solidarity. Just speak. And
Yes.
that's how those forms of oppression are being exported out of Palestine. And this affects all of us.
Yeah, as they say, right? We teach life, right? And what happens in Palestine is not going to stay in Palestine. That's a blueprint, I think, for what awaits us across the world. Whether you're in Canada or whether you're where I'm at in Pakistan. One can only pray that there's some measure of justice. If not in this lifetime, then you know perhaps in another. But thank you so much, Dr. Yipeng, and do say hi to Dr. Fawzia if you ever speak to her. I'm going to tell her I just spoke to you. I'm just going to message her.
I
And
guess
love to meet up briefly. Have a cup of coffee or something if I'm ever in Canada. So that would be great.
yeah, please do. Please stay in touch. And
I will. I will. I will. I've got your number now. Shall harass you.
that's right.
Take care. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.